In 218 BC, a 9-year-old boy stood in his father's war room and swore a blood oath before the altar of Baal. He would never make peace with Rome. He would pursue Rome to the ends of the earth. He would destroy Rome or die in the attempt. That boy was Hannibal Barca. This is not just a military story. This is the story of how a child's sworn oath became an obsession that shaped the destiny of two empires, cost hundreds of thousands of lives, and came within a single battle of destroying the Roman Republic forever. For over 2 decades, Hannibal pursued this blood oath. He crossed the Alps with elephants when everyone said it was impossible. He defeated Rome in battle after battle, victories so complete that Romans believed they were cursed by the gods. He brought Rome to its knees, not through a frontal assault on the city, but through psychological warfare, strategic brilliance, and an unshakable determination rooted in a 9-year-old's sworn promise to a dead father. But the oath had a price. Hannibal would never capture Rome. He would never see his blood oath completely fulfilled. And in the end, the boy who swore to destroy Rome would die an old man, hunted across the Mediterranean, his oath unfulfilled, his legacy caught between hero and villain, liberator and destroyer. This is a story about obsession, about what happens when a single moment, a child's promise, defines an entire life and reshapes history. It was one of the most consequential moments in the history of the Mediterranean world. And now you will learn the details. In the year 218 BC, a 9-year-old boy stood in a war room in Carthage, surrounded by the greatest military minds of North Africa. His name was Hannibal Barca. And on that single day, he made a promise that would echo across 2 centuries and shape the destiny of 2 civilizations. The boy was not alone. Standing before him was his father, Hannibal Barca, the legendary Carthaginian general, scarred from countless battles, a man whose name alone could make Roman generals tremble. Hannibal had called his son into the war room for a purpose. He was preparing to die. Not from wounds, though those covered his body like a history of warfare. He was preparing to march into a final battle against a Spanish rebellion, and he knew, with the certainty that comes from decades of warfare, that this would be his last campaign. Before his son, Hannibal did something extraordinary. He brought Hannibal to the altar of Baal, the Carthaginian god of war, and asked his young son to place his small hand upon the sacred stone. And then Hannibal spoke words that would define the next 50 years of Mediterranean history. "My son, I do not ask you to love Carthage. I ask you to hate Rome. I ask you to swear before Baal that you will never make peace with Rome, that you will pursue them to the ends of the earth, that you will destroy them or die in the attempt." What if I told you that this single moment, a father's dying wish whispered to a 9-year-old boy, would ignite a war so vast and so terrible that it would consume the lives of nearly 1 million people? That it would threaten to erase Rome itself from history? That it would produce a general so brilliant that military strategists 2,000 years later would still study his battles as the perfect examples of tactical genius? The boy placed his hand on the altar, and with the solemnity of a man taking his final oath before death, Hannibal swore, "I swear it. I will never make peace with Rome. I will pursue them. I will destroy them. Or I will die." Hannibal died 2 years later, killed in a Spanish ambush, cut down in the moment of his greatest victories. But his death changed nothing for Hannibal. The oath was sacred. The oath was everything. The oath was the only thing that mattered. For the next 2 decades, Hannibal would pursue this blood oath with a single-mindedness that bordered on madness. He would turn down peace negotiations with Rome when victory seemed within his grasp. He would refuse to capture Rome itself when military strategists begged him to march directly on the city. He would lose battles and win wars, lose wars and still achieve his strategic objectives, all because the oath was not simply about victory, it was about vengeance. It was about the fulfillment of a 9-year-old boy's promise made before an altar to a pagan god. But here is the tragic truth that many historians miss. Hannibal would never fully achieve his oath. He would come close. He would bring Rome to the very edge of collapse. But in the end, circumstances beyond his control, political divisions in Carthage, the brilliance of the Roman general Scipio, the jealousy of rival generals, would prevent him from delivering the final blow. And yet, even in this failure, Hannibal would achieve something perhaps greater than the complete destruction of Rome. He would become immortal. He would become the general by which all other generals are measured. He would become the man who proved that Rome was not invincible. He would become the living embodiment of the truth that a single human being, driven by an unshakable purpose, can reshape the world. It seemed in the year 218 BC that nothing could stop Rome's expansion. The Roman Republic had already conquered most of Italy and much of the Mediterranean. Their legions were disciplined, organized, and devastating. Rome had already defeated Carthage once, in the First Punic War, and had taken Sicily and other territories as tribute. Rome was ascending. Carthage was declining. But one man, a boy who had sworn a blood oath at an altar, would change that calculation. One man would prove that the logic of history was not inevitable, that empire was not destiny, that a single promise, made in desperation and sealed in sacred ritual, could alter the fate of nations. What do you think plays a greater role in history, the grand sweep of civilizational forces, or the singular obsession of one extraordinary individual? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next chapter of this incredible story. After his father's death, young Hannibal was adopted by his uncle Hasdrubal, the new commander of Carthaginian forces in Spain. But Hasdrubal recognized something in his nephew that was rare, a combination of military genius, strategic brilliance, and an almost supernatural ability to inspire absolute loyalty in his soldiers. By the time Hannibal was in his 20s, he was already a legend among the Carthaginian ranks. He had fought in Spain, commanding troops, learning the art of warfare not from dusty books but from the chaos of actual battle. He had suffered wounds. He had tasted defeat. He had experienced the exhilaration of victory. And through all of it, the blood oath remained his North Star, his constant, his obsession. When Hasdrubal was assassinated in 221 BC, murdered by a slave in an act of political revenge, the army unanimously chose Hannibal as their new commander. He was only 26 years old, but age was irrelevant. The soldiers recognized in him something they recognized in few men, a leader who was willing to die for his cause, who would never retreat, who viewed death not as a failure but as the only acceptable alternative to complete victory. Hannibal's first great campaign was the subjugation of Spain. The entire Iberian Peninsula was in a state of rebellion against Carthaginian rule. For 5 years, from 221 to 216 BC, Hannibal systematically conquered city after city, valley after valley, mountain range after mountain range. He was not just a military commander, he was a political genius. He made alliances with local tribes. He offered rewards to those who submitted peacefully. He showed absolutely no mercy to those who resisted. By 216 BC, Spain was firmly under Carthaginian control, and Hannibal had accumulated vast wealth and resources. More importantly, he had trained and hardened an army of Spanish mercenaries, Libyan soldiers, and Carthaginian professionals that was probably the most devastating military force the world had yet seen. These were not conscripted soldiers fighting for abstract patriotism. These were professional soldiers fighting under a general they worshipped, fighting for a cause they believed in, fighting under a commander who had proven through 1,000 battles that he would never ask them to do something he was not willing to do himself. The strategic importance of Hannibal's position in Spain cannot be overstated. Spain was the gateway to Italy. Spain was rich in silver mines that funded Carthaginian military operations. Spain was the staging ground for any invasion of the Roman heartland. And Hannibal, now firmly established as the supreme military authority in Spain, was in a position to threaten Rome in a way that no Carthaginian leader had managed since Hannibal Barca. Rome understood this threat. In fact, Rome was terrified. Roman senators and generals debated furiously about what to do about this young, charismatic, brilliant general who was gathering an army on their doorstep. Some wanted to attack Spain directly. Others wanted to negotiate. But most recognized a fundamental truth. Hannibal was not interested in negotiation. Hannibal had sworn a blood oath as a 9-year-old boy, and a blood oath in the ancient world was a sacred bond that superseded all other considerations. In 219 BC, Hannibal made his move. He attacked Saguntum, a Spanish city that was technically a Roman ally. Rome sent diplomatic protests. Hannibal ignored them. Hannibal besieged Saguntum for 8 months. The defenders fought with extraordinary courage. The siege became one of the most brutal of the ancient world. Finally, in desperation, rather than surrender to Carthage, the defenders of Saguntum set fires in their own city, threw themselves from walls, and essentially committed mass suicide. The entire city was destroyed. Tens of thousands of people died. When Rome learned of the destruction of Saguntum, the response was unambiguous: war. Rome declared war on Carthage in 218 BC. This would become known as the Second Punic War, and it would last for 18 years, consume hundreds of thousands of lives, and nearly destroy the Roman Republic itself. But here's what makes Hannibal's story so extraordinary. When war was declared, Hannibal was not in Spain. And he was not preparing to defend Spain against a Roman invasion. Instead, he was preparing to do something that military strategists had declared impossible. He was preparing to invade Italy directly. Have faith. You have definitely never heard of a military maneuver as audacious as what Hannibal was about to attempt. The conventional military wisdom of the time was absolute and unambiguous. Italy was Rome's fortress. The legions defending Italian soil were the best trained, most experienced soldiers in the world. Rome's system of fortified cities, allied client states, and defensive networks made invasion by an external force essentially impossible. No general in his right mind would attempt a direct invasion of Italian territory. But Hannibal was not thinking with the logic of conventional military strategy. Hannibal was thinking with the logic of a 9-year-old boy who had sworn a blood oath at an altar to his dead father. Hannibal was thinking with the logic of obsession. He decided to take his army, march northward through Spain, cross the Pyrenees, march through Gaul, and then, in what would become the most famous military maneuver in ancient history, cross the Alps with war elephants. When military advisors heard this plan, they laughed. Elephants cannot cross the Alps. Soldiers cannot march through snow and ice for weeks. The local Celtic tribes would attack them. They would be destroyed before they even reached Italy. Hannibal listened to all these objections. And then he did exactly what he had planned to do. In 218 BC, Hannibal began the most audacious military campaign in the history of ancient warfare. He gathered 50,000 infantry soldiers, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. He said goodbye to Spain, knowing he would likely never see it again. And he marched north. What if I told you that this single decision, to invade Italy directly instead of defending Spain, would ultimately determine the outcome of the war? That it would bring Rome to the brink of destruction? That it would prove that geography and conventional military wisdom could be overcome by the combination of military genius and unshakable determination? The march through the Pyrenees and across Gaul took months. Soldiers deserted. Local tribes attacked. Supply lines were stretched impossibly thin. Half of Hannibal's elephants died in the crossing. But Hannibal pressed onward, driven by the same obsession that had driven him since childhood. And then came the Alps. The crossing of the Alps in late 218 BC is one of the most legendary military achievements in history. Soldiers had to march through mountain passes buried in snow. Horses slipped on ice and fell to their deaths. Soldiers froze to death in their sleep. The Celtic tribes that inhabited the Alpine passes attacked with ferocity. At certain points, Hannibal's army was literally fighting on 3 fronts: against the mountains themselves, against the weather, and against the Celtic warriors. When Hannibal's army finally emerged from the Alps into the Po Valley in northern Italy, less than half of his soldiers remained alive. Thousands had died in the crossing. But what emerged from those mountains was not a defeated, exhausted force. What emerged was the most psychologically devastating military force that Rome had ever faced. The soldiers who had survived the Alps believed themselves to be invincible. They had crossed a barrier that conventional military wisdom said was impassable. They had marched with elephants through snow. They had done the impossible. And now they stood on Italian soil, ready to fulfill the blood oath of their commander. Rome did not know what hit them. The moment Hannibal's army emerged from the Alps and set foot on Italian soil, the entire strategic situation in the Mediterranean shifted. Rome had assumed it would fight Carthage in Spain or on the seas. Rome had not seriously contemplated that Hannibal would bring the war directly to Italy. Rome had assumed it would always be the aggressor, the invader, the force attacking Carthaginian territory. But Hannibal had reversed the entire logic of the war. In 218 BC, at the Trebia River in northern Italy, the two armies met for the first time. Rome sent a force under the command of Publius Cornelius Scipio, one of their best generals. The Roman army was larger and better equipped. The Roman legions were the most disciplined soldiers in the world. And Hannibal destroyed them. The Battle of Trebia was not even close. Hannibal used cavalry tactics, terrain advantages, and superior strategy to overwhelm the Roman force. Thousands of Roman soldiers died. Thousands more were taken prisoner. It was not a military victory, it was a psychological devastation. When Rome learned of the destruction at Trebia, panic spread through the city. How was this possible? How had their legions been defeated by an army that had just crossed impossible terrain? How had a Carthaginian general accomplished what military strategists said was impossible? But Hannibal was just getting started. Over the next 16 years, Hannibal would fight a series of battles that would become legendary for their brilliance and their brutality. He would defeat Rome again and again. At the Trebia, he crushed the Romans. At the Lake Trasimene, he annihilated two Roman armies, killing perhaps 25,000 soldiers in a single day. At Cannae, he fought what military strategists still consider to be the perfect battle, a double envelopment where Roman legions, superior in numbers, were surrounded and systematically destroyed. After Cannae, Rome came within perhaps a single battle of complete collapse. Entire provinces rebelled against Rome and declared allegiance to Hannibal. Rome's allies began to defect. It seemed, in 216 BC after the Battle of Cannae, that the Roman Republic itself was finished. But what happened next is one of the most extraordinary demonstrations of collective will in human history. Instead of surrendering, instead of negotiating a peace treaty, instead of admitting defeat, Rome doubled down. Rome recruited new legions. Rome appointed a new commander, Fabius Maximus, who understood that the only way to defeat Hannibal was not through direct confrontation but through attrition, wearing down Hannibal's army over time, preventing him from achieving decisive victories, and slowly grinding away at his resources and manpower. For over a decade, this war of attrition continued. Hannibal would win battles, but he could not capture Rome itself. He could not break the will of the Roman people. He could not destroy Rome's ability to recruit new soldiers. And as the years passed, the balance of power slowly began to shift. What if I told you that Hannibal's greatest victories were also the beginning of his ultimate defeat? That winning battle after battle, he was actually losing the war? The fundamental problem that Hannibal faced was that Rome had resources and manpower that Carthage could not match. Rome's territory was vast. Rome's population was large. Rome's system of allied states provided constant supplies and reinforcements. Hannibal, brilliant though he was, could not sustain an invasion force indefinitely on enemy territory without access to supply lines. Carthage, for its part, was not providing Hannibal with the resources he needed. Political divisions in Carthage meant that Hannibal's requests for reinforcements were often ignored. His brother Hasdrubal tried to bring reinforcements from Spain, but was defeated and killed. Hannibal's situation, while never desperate enough to force retreat, became increasingly untenable. And then in 203 BC, a new threat emerged from Africa itself. The young Roman general Scipio Africanus invaded North Africa and threatened Carthage directly. For the first time, Hannibal was forced to leave Italy and return to Africa to defend his homeland. The two greatest generals of the ancient world met at Zama in 202 BC. Hannibal had spent nearly 20 years in Italy, undefeated in battle, but unable to achieve his ultimate objective of destroying Rome. Scipio had spent years learning from Hannibal's tactics, studying his methods, and preparing for this final confrontation. Hannibal was defeated. It was not a total annihilation like Cannae, but it was a decisive Roman victory. After 20 years of invasion, after hundreds of thousands of deaths, after bringing Rome to the brink of destruction, Hannibal's dream of fulfilling his blood oath was shattered. The aftermath of Zama was a political catastrophe for Hannibal and Carthage. Carthage was forced to sue for peace. The city had to pay a crushing indemnity to Rome. Carthage had to give up Spain. Carthage had to dismantle much of its military power. For Hannibal personally, the consequences were even more devastating. Political enemies in Carthage, jealous of his power and influence, began to work against him. He was accused of prolonging the war unnecessarily. He was blamed for the ultimate defeat. Though he was not executed, respect for his military genius prevented that. He was effectively exiled from Carthage. Hannibal spent his remaining years as a fugitive. He attempted to gather forces for another war against Rome. He tried to incite rebellions in various Mediterranean regions. But the moment had passed. Rome was now the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. Hannibal's blood oath, the sacred promise he had made as a 9-year-old boy before the altar of Baal, remained unfulfilled. In his final years, hunted by both Romans and his own enemies, Hannibal took his own life rather than be captured. Legend says he poisoned himself. Others claim he died in battle. The exact circumstances of his death remain shrouded in mystery. But one thing is certain. Hannibal died knowing that his blood oath would never be fulfilled. Rome still stood. Rome had actually grown stronger. And the boy who had sworn to destroy Rome had failed. But here is the extraordinary truth that history reveals. In failing to destroy Rome, Hannibal achieved something perhaps greater. He proved that Rome was not invincible. He proved that an individual of exceptional talent and unshakable determination could reshape history. He proved that a sacred oath, made in desperation and sealed in blood, could echo across decades and alter the destiny of nations. Military strategists for 2,000 years would study Hannibal's battles. The techniques he developed, double envelopment, the use of terrain, the psychological manipulation of enemies, would become the foundation of military strategy. Young generals would learn from Hannibal. Military academies would teach Hannibal's methods. In a real sense, Hannibal became immortal through his very failure. Rome would eventually decline and fall, not to Hannibal's sword, but to the same internal corruptions and external pressures that eventually destroy all empires. But Hannibal had proven something essential, that empires are not eternal, that Rome was mortal, that even the greatest power on earth could be brought to the brink of destruction by one man's determination. The blood oath was never fully fulfilled, but in the pursuit of it, Hannibal became the greatest general of the ancient world. He became the man by whom all other generals would be measured. He became immortal not through victory, but through the extraordinary nobility of his struggle. The news of Hannibal's death spread slowly through the Mediterranean world. In Rome, there was relief. The great enemy was finally gone. But there was also something else, a strange sense of loss. Rome had defined itself, for 2 decades, through opposition to Hannibal. Hannibal had been the shadow that haunted Roman nightmares. And now that shadow was gone. But Hannibal's legacy refused to fade. For centuries after his death, Roman generals would find themselves compared to Hannibal. Were they as brilliant? Were they as daring? Could they achieve what Hannibal had achieved? The answer was almost always no. Hannibal had set a standard of military genius that few could match. Military academies across the world, from the Ottoman Empire to Napoleon's France to modern military academies, would study Hannibal's campaigns as the perfect examples of tactical brilliance. His strategy at Cannae, where he surrounded a numerically superior Roman army, would be taught as the ideal of battlefield maneuver. His crossing of the Alps with elephants would be studied as an example of how to accomplish the seemingly impossible through will and determination. But there was a bittersweet quality to this legacy. Hannibal had not destroyed Rome. The blood oath remained unfulfilled. And this unfulfilled promise became, paradoxically, what made Hannibal's story so tragic and so compelling. Here is the universal truth that Hannibal's story reveals. Sometimes the greatest human achievements are not measured in victory, but in the nobility of the struggle itself. Sometimes what matters most is not whether you achieve your ultimate goal, but whether you pursue that goal with such determination, such brilliance, and such sacrifice that you reshape the world through the very attempt. Hannibal's blood oath was never fully satisfied, but in the pursuit of it he brought the most powerful empire on earth to the brink of destruction, proved that human will and determination could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, established himself as the greatest military mind of the ancient world, created a legend that would inspire warriors and generals for 2,000 years, demonstrated that a single individual, driven by an unshakable purpose, can alter the course of history. The blood oath that Hannibal swore as a 9-year-old boy, the promise to destroy Rome or die in the attempt, was never fully realized. But it was this very unfulfillment that made Hannibal's legacy eternal. What other legendary figures from history would you like to see in our next issues? What stories of blood oaths, sacred promises, and obsession have captured your imagination? Suggest your topics in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new fascinating stories from the past. Because Hannibal's blood oath reminds us of one essential truth: the greatest stories are not always about victory. Sometimes they are about the courage to struggle against impossible odds. Sometimes they are about a promise made before an altar that shapes the entire course of your life. And sometimes they are about how a single human being, driven by obsession and determination, can reshape the destiny of empires. Hannibal the Great, the boy who swore to destroy Rome, the general who nearly succeeded, the legend who proved that greatness is measured not in victory, but in the nobility of the attempt.